So thought we could talk about Marx a little bit, about the poverty of philosophy, which I know you've been reading and I've been thinking about. And going to start doing a class on it soon, which is why it's on my mind. So this is, I guess, just to kind of like get us started off. I mean, how would you think about like what the sort of um, project is that like that like the kind of argument that Marx is building in that book?
Um, what is the argument Marx is building in that book? Well, I think he's trying to talk about the way that the movement of philosophical thought tends to take itself as its own reference point for how it evaluates social reality. So I think that's why it's called the poverty of philosophy. That on the one hand, he's trying to say that philosophical concepts don't really have intrinsic meaning in themselves. They are relative to how we navigate a social reality and interpret them. So this is kind of important because, I mean, it's an obvious point if you have a materialist perspective, but I think he's trying to explain why materialism is actually a really difficult philosophical perspective to maintain, because it is the tendency of thought to do this thing, to reify categories and to use categories as substitutes for social analysis as opposed to for doing social analysis. And he does this for whatever reason, in a text about Proudhon. And I'm not really a Marx scholar, so you'd have to ask somebody, what got him into that, because he, it's something that he also does with other authors, but he seized upon Proudhon in particular.
Yeah, right. So I mean, he's responding. One of the things he's doing in that book is responding to Proudhon's the poverty, philosophy of poverty. Uh, but there is this sort of more interesting kind of basic question about materialism there, and I guess actually, I mean, maybe like an interesting way to like approach this would be just kind of thinking about like because people throw this word around a lot, materialism in ways that maybe means like slightly different things in different contexts. I mean, just maybe kind of a simple-minded question, but I mean, like what do like what does that word mean to Marx? I mean, what's like how is it different from like the positions he's criticizing? I mean, why is that a good thing to be? Why should we care about that, having like a materialist analysis as opposed to some other kind?
That's actually a pretty much more difficult question than it sounds like. So I once had a Hegel professor put it to me in the following way.
Yeah.
So I was taking a course on the phenomenology of spirit. So normally when you do Hegel, if you do Hegel in graduate school, you'll probably find yourself taking courses on just like a single book.
Yeah.
So I was taking a course on the phenomenology, and my teacher, who liked Marx quite a bit, and he told me, however, that he liked Marx because he thought Marx was actually a Hegelian and never succeeded in the materialist challenge to German idealism. And he said that if you can convince me that what Hegel says in the first section of the phenomenology about sense perception is wrong, then I will become a materialist. And, put in a sort of vulgar way, I get like in a simplistic way, if you can prove to me that I can have access to the knowledge in the thing in itself, the object of my observation, the thing in itself, without first that thing being reflected in my own consciousness vis-a-vis concepts. Okay, so if I have access to the thing outside, like in a way that is prior and not anterior to my concept of the thing or its representation in thought, then I will be a materialist. And he thinks that that is an impossible objection to overcome. So I think that I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but like if you are an idealist, being able to think of the world external to your own concepts is impossible, and therefore analyzing concepts themselves is the movement of concepts themselves is the most important thing. And I guess the materialist is trying to say something different, that the relationships between concepts and the world is more reciprocal in some sense, that concepts themselves don't have intrinsic meaning outside of how they are shaped by our activity, which you don't need to conceptualize to do. Like we have lots of human activity that is not entirely concept laden. We have partial concepts, like language is something that seems to that we often find inadequate we're constantly searching, so it's searching for language, searching for concepts, amending concepts to be suitable to a social terrain that we navigate. We struggle with like the ineffability of our emotions and so on and so forth. So the argument is that concepts are emergent properties of social relationships in some sense. And I think that that's basically a materialist metaphysic. But I'm not a metaphysician, so
Yeah, I do wonder. Just
somebody can be quite unhappy with the way I've described that, I'm sure.
Sure. I'm just a little bit curious though, because about your Hegel professor's position, because that seems like a really high bar, and I wonder like what I wonder what kind of materialism idealism distinction that latches onto, because if you have to um, like have perfect access to like material things as they are themselves, without sort of any conceptual anything in your head mediating that in any way. And if that's the question, then it's like, okay, I guess not. But I mean, it certainly seems like you don't have to be, an idealist, definitely in the strong sense of thinking that it's like either all there is like ideas, mental things, and there really aren't any, material things in themselves, or even in that Kantian kind of way of like, Kant flavored kind of way of like saying that the only, maybe there are things themselves, but we can't know anything about them, and all we can know about is ideas. I mean, it's like, it seems like there's a leap to either of those conclusions from just like, we can't have this like totally perfect access to things as they are themselves with like zero mediation from any like conceptual categories in our heads or anything like that. I mean, like it's sort of, I mean, I guess just put really crudely, it seems like we can, there could be stuff out there, and we can have like some knowledge of it that's imperfect because there are like conceptual categories that we're using in some way to like try to get at it, and those and like those might lead us to, I don't know. I mean, like, do you kind of see what I'm trying to grope at there? I mean, maybe that's just a different way of saying what you said.
I think it's a little off base. I don't think it's that kind of strong structure of reality argument. So like I think it's more epistemological, and I think that what Hegel is I think what Hegel is doing is picking up where Kant left off, which is like turn to critical metaphysics. Yeah. So it's not like the metaphysics. So Kant's shift to critical metaphysics is actually a shift to an epistemology in a certain sense, that because I can't know the thing in itself, there's a kind of agnosticism about that like it's either there or not there. You can postulate that it's there, but you postulate that it's there because you have to. So like Hegel, I think, because the reference point is human history and like how humans can know themselves as agents of history. It's in a way, it's kind of neither here nor there whether or not there's a world out there. You can take for granted that we have to assume that there is, and what we're talking about is how we know ourselves as agents of history and in the world. And his position is like, you have to, like, I just can't do that without the mediation of concepts. And insofar as those are always self-referential, then that is, for all intents and purposes, the thing in itself. So like I think that I think it doesn't have to be so wacky as like we can or cannot know that there's a world out there. It's about how we know the nature of the world out there. And I think that that's a much more difficult argument to overcome for the materialist position. Wow, the sun came out, so I'm starting to look very strange. What am I trying to say? I think it's a harder argument for the materialist to overcome because the materialist has to show that there is some other way of knowing the world, and Hegelians would just say there isn't. Does that kind of make sense?
No, sure. I get that. I mean, I do wonder if like some of the same points could be applied for either one. Like, in other words, if it's not like okay, I understand. So if it's not like we can't know that there is a world, it's that we can't know sort of the nature of the world, because if we start trying to investigate it, what we're really going to end up investigating is these concepts that just sort of point to themselves, and so our knowledge of the nature of the world isn't really going to be of this like underlying material world. It's really going to be of the concepts. But I wonder if some of the same points about how
like reason itself,
right, would apply to that, right? That in other words, like if I'm just maybe I'm just thinking about your Hegel professor's challenge that you said at the beginning about like, oh, there'd be a materialist if you could overcome this. That if if it's still sort of setting the bar kind of artificially high because it could be that we have imperfect access to the nature of things as they are themselves because we need to use concepts and language and all of that stuff, and but like, does that really mean that we could have no access to the way that things like really are in themselves?
I don't know. I mean, what's the stakes of saying that for you? Because I would say that the reason the idealist challenge is strong is that most of the history of social sciences pursues things that way. Like it is clearly much easier for human beings to think about history as the legacy and innovation and development of their own thoughts about the world than it is to consider the world. So because materialist research is so difficult, in a way, like the like idealists can seem pretty wacky, but like it's not wacky because that's basically what we do, And so if you think about something like sociological idealism, like Foucault, a kind of discourse interpretation that you kind of try to see like how it disperses, and then you talk about discourse as a form of power in itself and Like that is pretty much what that is. You deny that there is an essence of the thing there, and that what matters is the confluence of, like, what matters is how we construct the object as we make it. So we don't have access to an object outside of the construction of our own discourse. And then they turn around and say that, like, that in a sense, it is material. Like discourse is material because you are creating the object, but the way through which you know it is through that act of creation. So, like, I guess if the bar is high, I think it should be high in a way, because if it weren't that high, then you would see a lot more materialist analysis going on. Like I actually, I feel like I'm a little out of my depth here, because again, I'm really not a metaphysician, and I'm really not an epistemologist.
Well,
but if the social sciences are any indicator of like what idealism has going for it, that's that is what it has. That's it.
Yeah, right. So maybe, like, I think some of what you said about Foucault and all that kind of takes us a little bit closer to the agenda, the poverty philosophy, since you're talking not just about this sort of view from 10,000 feet questions about metaphysics or epistemology, but about, idealism or materialism as approaches to thinking about history and politics, and so I wonder if we could kind of just ground it in that, right? Because that's what, in sort of criticizing what he sees in Proudhon, and in kind of getting closer to what, his collaborator Engels would much later call scientific socialism. Marx is, like, is interested in materialism as an approach to thinking about how history develops, how and when there's the possibility of, moving towards socialism. And I wanted to kind of relate all of this to that, so I wonder, like, you talked about, idealism as an approach to social science research. So I mean, like, maybe one way of kind of going forward here would be to talk a little bit about, like, how you see, like, okay, so if idealism as an approach to history or social sciences is trying to understand human societies and their development in terms of thinking about ideas, thinking about, like, how we're like looking at our own concepts, and how we're conceiving it as, like, a sort of basic explanatory thing, that, like, what's the sort of better but maybe harder materialist thing that Marx wants to do?
Well, I think it's not that clear all the time, but what he's clearly really worried about in this text is that, I mean, at least this is just what I got from it after taking a look at it this time around, is that you have these concepts that are being sort of retrofitted onto social reality that, Proudhon is borrowing from Hegel. And he's kind of projecting, like, his own sense of what those concepts mean onto the social reality. And in some sense, it becomes a really seductive form of, like, intellectual narcissism. And Marx is trying to say that there has to be a way of interrogating the content of the concepts without being totally self-referential in your ability to, in your meaning, in the way you use their meaning. They have to somehow track material processes in a pretty specific sense. Like they have to. So, take concepts like equality or race or I think those are the two that stand out to me because Marx was writing about equality, and I think people write about like race as a changing concept quite frequently.
Mm-hmm.
They obviously change their content over time, what we expect from them, what we want from them. They're, in a sense, they're kind of they signify shifts in our social expectations and in our relationships with one another. But when you decide to take these concepts and have a look at history with them, suddenly history is moving around a lot more than what your existing expectations of the concepts are, like what you think it is, which is why historians have to be so careful with their use of concepts, because if you're going to go back to the 18th century and talk about what someone meant by equality, it means something different than now. The reason for that has to be the change in which that becomes meaningful to us. So there has to be this kind of other work that you do to try to understand it. And that's, that's like what Marx starts to develop, I think, in this essay. I think it was published before Capital, and it was only like translated into English after the publication of Capital. He's trying to see how these economic concepts start to have an internal logical relation amongst themselves that are not reflecting the social relationships that make them meaningful. They're a kind of a projection of what people think is valuable and useful about the concepts. So I'm not sure Marx gives like all the time a much better answer.
That last part seemed really important. Could you say that again? Kind of slow down on that, because that last point that you just made.
Which one? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, about the economic concepts.
So the economic concepts that like economists use, they have an internal logical relation in their own theory. They allow for like kind of predictive capacities. You're able to see patterns, and they all have a function within the theory itself. Yeah, like the theory kind of hangs together. Like in a classical economic theory or a neoclassical economic theory, you have this kind of internal logic. And the problem for Marx is like, why do these concepts have the meaning and signification that they have? And why, and how is that a projection of the theorist's own expectations of those concepts? Mm-hmm. And this is kind of where you get the arguments about concepts this is what I think he's trying to say, that concepts don't have a determinate meaning. That's the problem. So neoclassical economists use concepts for predictive capacities and their patterns and so on, and as did classical economists. But these concepts are not necessarily, they have their fecundity in the social relationships in the world. So they can't mean the same thing as changing social relationships emerge, and yet people continue to try to systematize them in a particular way. And Marx thinks that it's the lack of consideration of the social relationships, the patterns of conflict, and so on, that make it seem like they have intrinsic meaning. And so does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I think maybe this gets to something interesting about the critique of Proudhon going on in the Poverty of Philosophy. I mean, certainly that he expresses elsewhere. So I mean, one of the things that made me think that it'd be interesting to go back and look at this book is something Marx says right at the beginning of Capital, in like the second footnote in like the whole book. He talks about Proudhon. He says Proudhon creates his ideal of justice. I'm so embarrassed about my French pronunciation here, Justice Citronneau, from the juridical relations that correspond to the production of commodities. He therefore proves to the consolation of all good petit bourgeois that the production of commodities is a form as eternal as justice. and then he turns around and seeks to reform the actual production of commodities and the corresponding legal system in accordance with this ideal. And then he asks, what would we, and I think this is the line that made me think of what you were just saying, what would we think of a chemist who, instead of studying the actual laws, governing molecular interactions, and on that basis solving definite problems, claim to regulate those interactions by means of the eternal ideals of naturalité and affinité. Do we really know any more about usury? We say it contradicts justice éternelle, equité éternelle, mutualité fraternelle, and other vérités éternelles that the fathers of the early church did when they said it was incompatible with grace éternelle, foi internationale, and I'm not even going to try a bunch of religious phrases that he's quoting there, and it seems so. I mean, I guess try to relate this to some of what you were just saying, that Marx, thinks that Proudhon, and not just Proudhon, but I mean, he's his third sort of immediate target there, is trying to understand capitalism sort of by means of looking at the relationships between these concepts in ways that aren't going to tell us very much about the kind of underlying, economic structures of the material world.
Okay, let me give an example. I don't know if this is helpful. I was writing about this recently. You know how like in political philosophy, there's this discussion about like Rawlsian ideal theory versus non-ideal theory? Okay.
Yep.
So I'll just, for just the audience, I'll recapitulate. Like Rawls has this idea of justice, and he calls it's an ideal theory of justice. It's literally it's a normative theory. It's how you think things ought to be. Okay, which means that by definition, all the things that not ought to be are not there in the theory because they are unjust. Yeah. So like people criticize Rawls. Okay, Rawls, like you define racism and sexism out of ideal theory, which means that you're not able to criticize racism and sexism because by definition, they are not a part of your theory, which means that you actually lack critical tools to think constructively about them because you are constantly only thinking about what you should be instead of what is, which is a kind of inequality. Okay, so then non-ideal theorists will be like, okay, well, we'll take liberal justice is kind of like the reference point. We agree, justice good, but we need to theorize about non-ideal conditions. We need to theorize about injustice. So we're going to take injustice as the starting point and see how it compares. I think that like this is the kind of move that Marx would just find wildly fishy. He would be like, okay, it's you like it does like what you're doing, kind of comparing inequality, injustice, justice. You're kind of seeing two sides of a coin, but the social movement of those concepts is not emerging in your thought. And therefore the social meaning of those concepts is not emerging in your thought. And it doesn't that doesn't prevent like, certain first order conceptions of what's going on in the world from becoming reified and ideological, because everything depends on what you think the world is actually like, how it works, it's system logic and so on. Likewise, like neoclassic, and here's an analogy, like, and the reason that kind of that way of thinking about justice occurs to me is that the analogous point is like neoclassical economists, they model perfect market competition. Okay, so like by definition, perfect market competition doesn't allow for exploitation. Exploitation only happens if markets don't clear in the labor market. So when you define the market as in principle just and non-exploitative, then all the imperfections, like what they call imperfect market competition, like sort of appears as this like deviation from the norm. And then the norm doesn't itself, like the meaning of that norm, like what is considered normal, not like normative, but normal in this case, that doesn't get interrogated. So we have this world of perfect competition, then we have imperfect competition, but it's like weird how exploitation can't emerge here except as an imperfection. So what he's trying to say is that when you have, and he calls these like religious, that's why he has this religious metaphor, because it's like, it's never the concepts themselves that are wrong. It's always like the faulty human individuals that don't live up to the concepts who are wrong. And therefore, like, you're never able to see like the real social movement of history. And like, this is why he's skeptical of normative concepts, not because he doesn't approve of norms. I don't think Marx is actually like really hostile to thinking about things like justice and freedom. He just is skeptical of these particular methods for thinking about those things because they tend to see concepts as like having fixed meanings and reference points, and then the only thing that changes is us, like we're the sinners, basically. Mm-hmm. Does that like help make sense, those examples?
Yeah, I think so. Because it seems like there are two things going on here, and one of them is, and you know, I mean, they're related, obviously, but is about how to understand economic structures, and then the other one is how to understand what's bad about those economic structures, I guess. Mm-hmm. So like in you know, so in you know, when he, and there are things that Marx says that, you know, in that, you know, quote of Capital and in the poverty philosophy that, you know, might suggest that he's talking about both of those. But like, you know, certainly if, I mean, the point about kind of perfect competition not involving exploitation, I think brings it out nicely, because if you know, if you want to understand capitalism, right, you know, from Marx's point of view, I mean, you should like this sort of relationship between, you know, workers and capitalists, which is actually kind of like a mystery on some like abstract models of economics, like why, you know, why there should even be like bosses that like, you know, say, well, you know, why don't people just sort of do these other arrangements, you know, like sort of that, you know, if you're just thinking about abstract interactions between buyers and sellers, then like why you get firms at all is actually becomes a mystery for, you know, on some like a priori economic models. And if you're just sort of saying like, well, this is the way that things would be, like if you know, like this is all just sort of, well, the world is a little bit messier than the model, then, you know, it's not really a model of the thing that from Marx's perspective is most important to study, which is the you know, the class relations, the sort of what he would see as, you know, the underlying laws of, you know, capitalist production, which are all the stuff that just becomes sort of the like, well, the world is messier than the model on this other way of thinking about it, right? Then, so that's one question, is sort of studying capitalism in itself, and then the other question is that what is it's bad about capitalism? You know, what's you know, what's wrong with it? And there is also this suggestion that in that quote, certainly, that what Proudhon is sort of latching onto is what's bad about capitalism is the set of ideals that are actually just sort of derived from capitalist property relations themselves, that, you know, that like maybe in a, you know, maybe in like a different or better society, you know, we just wouldn't even think of those terms anymore because those are sort of ultimately derived from the kind of legal structures that, you know, grow up around capitalist property relations.
Can you say that last part again? Were you attributing that to Proudhon or to Marx?
No. Okay, so Marx. So Marx Marx in the quote in Capital says that he's describing this certain set of ideals that it says that Proudhon cares about, and in that he says he Marx, Proudhon creates his ideal of justice, justice éternelle, from the juridical relations that correspond to the production of commodities, right? So that there also seems to be this suggestion that, like, it's not just that this is a sort of bad way of understanding how capitalism, that the descriptive part is a bad way of understanding how capitalism works, but that the normative part is itself, like, derived from the ideals of capitalist society in a way that's a problem.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is like, it's so I think Marx, like I said, he's not against all, this is just my interpretation, people disagree with this, but I don't think he's against all normative theorizing. I think he actually thinks it's an like almost an epistemic fact about, like, how an ontological fact even, that we posit how we think things ought to be quite a bit. So it's just that he doesn't think that we should be doing so positing in a way that is accepting the terms and conditions that apply. Yeah. So, like, what one concept means now need not be how it means later. And what we are doing, because we are striving beings, normatively, we have expectations and hopes and desires and dreams, that what we are usually doing in our own activity is kind of positing the conditions for future such strivings. So I think human practices are basically all normatively laden in this way. And that would be the most consistent way of thinking about materialism as a method. But the problem is that these concepts tend to become self-referential and therefore ideological. So the other thing I would say is that, like, he's talking about the process of idealizing things, not just abstracting things, like having ideal concepts in the sense of giving certain concepts like positive normative traits. Charles Mills makes this distinction, and I think it's really helpful, where, like, the problem is idealizing the terms and conditions that apply just by definitional fiat. You're like, okay, we want equality. Well, where I'm just going to flatten the social world so that we get equality as what it means to me right now. And then that might in fact be inequality. That's the problem. So, but he's not saying that, like, all abstraction has this problem. So all social theories require abstraction. That's like the moment, the idealist moment, that Marx is actually saying, yeah, actually, fine. Like, we do need concepts to mediate our relationship to the world. That's inevitable. That might be an ontological fact about us. But we need to see those concepts as a part of an activity. Concepts are attached to practices in the world. And that is what their meanings, that's where their actual meanings lie in our interpretation of the world. So the problem with a theory of justice, for example, or in an economic theory, isn't just that they have no bearing on reality whatsoever and that they're all completely false. It's that something like perfect competition has an intrinsically mystifying role in helping us to interpret reality, because it defines itself as separate from our reality, and that's the problem. So, like, I think, like, Anwar Sheikh talks about this quite a bit. So, like, and actually I get the idea of, like, the religious view. I think he gets that from Marx, and I got that from Anwar Sheikh, who, he says, if you look at this kind of dynamic in economics, perfect versus imperfect competition, when you define reality as imperfect, but concepts as perfect, it means that you're taking the concepts out of reality and then you're judging reality with those concepts. And that is, of course, never going to be an interrogation of the usefulness or the appropriateness of the concepts themselves. And I think that's a well enough description of, like, how ideology works.
Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess I wonder, right? So about though then the distinction that you're making, because it seems um, like when you say that that Marx is not like kind of accepts that we're going to sort of make normative judgments inevitably, and that like is not against theorizing about them and sort of trying to get them right, which seems totally right to me. But then a lot of what you're just saying, like I think could very easily be taken to be like no, right? Because like if it's sort of problematic to extract concepts from reality and then use the concept to judge reality, then isn't that what we're doing anytime we're making value judgments? I mean, this or anytime we're sort of theorizing certainly about like justice or injustice. I mean, what's the way of I mean, I guess one way to ask it would just be like, okay, I mean, big question, I know, apologize in advance, but I mean, it's like, what's the way of thinking about justice and injustice where you aren't, in some sense, extracting concepts from reality and then using them to judge reality?
I mean, I don't know, but I think Marx thinks it's dialectics. Like, I think that's what the reason immanent critique became his strategy. So, like, I don't have like a, I don't know, but for like, that's the Hegelian Marxist response. And if one is like really hostile to the idea of dialectics, then you might just say all these concerns don't matter. But I think Marx, that's what I think Marx is saying about Proudhon, and I think Marx thinks they matter.
Yeah, I mean, so dialectics is a phrase that I think even within the Marxist tradition means like really different things in different contexts. Like one, I mean, I guess I am, because like one thing that people often seem to mean when they talk about dialectical language is just, sort of, being alive to the ways in which things are in motion, that they change because of sort of internal antagonisms, within them, stuff like that. And that's like a fairly benign and hard to argue with, version of dialectics. But I mean, like when you're, I think I know what you mean about the Hegelian Marxist way of saying that you're always so is the point about immanent critique just like you're I mean, if you're doing immanent critique, you're sort of judging things by their own standards. You're entering into something's self-conception and and using that to criticize it. I guess if you really wanted to push this, though, I mean, isn't that still judging reality by concepts?
So I actually don't know if that is how immanent critique should be understood. Like, I don't really have a really well elaborated point of view of what this is, of what this means, but the best I can guess is that there's a couple things that it's trying not to be. And like, if people are interested in this and they're like, sharing your skepticism that it really can be anything different. I have a colleague of mine just told me recently that he's totally over immanent critique and now fully endorses the external variety. But the point isn't really that you just take the own self-conception of the social order. I think it's more that you understand that what you are usually doing is in some sense reconstructing the norms of that order as you try to criticize them. So you are participating in the movement of thought, and you don't have the illusion of having an external perspective, because your own use of those concepts is going to have be laden with the same contradictions that those concepts have in reality. So I honestly don't know if I find this persuasive or if it can be rescued. I mean, like, if people in the audience are curious, Rahel Yegi's trying to revive this. Like, and this is the predominant way of thinking about social criticism in the Frankfurt School, and she's trying to adapt a kind of pragmatist's immanent critique, and I think it's very interesting. I don't know if it will be successful, but I don't think it's the same thing as just like, I'm going to accept the norms as they are and then criticize them on their own terms. It's a kind of active reconstruction of the norms so that thought understands itself to be a part of a contradictory process. And the skepticism that the immanent critique people have of an external perspective is just that these concepts don't become self-reflective in that way, and they tend to become ideological, or they tend to kind of flatten social contradictions in a way that is to them unhelpful. And I'm not really sure.
No, that makes so okay. So I think like what I mean, just to not to even argue with it, but just to make sure I'm kind of understanding the point of view, like what people who think that all you can do is immanent critique take themselves to be doing is you're entering into this system of norms that you sort of find waiting for you and kind of helping to sort of bring out contradictions in it that help to kind of that in a way that helps to like change those norms from the inside, but you're just inevitably it's like the it's I don't know, it's like Neurath's boat. You have to like reconstruct it from the inside. That there's no way to get the there's no way to there's no way to criticize it on the basis of something that like just comes from outside of it or fully transcends it, because all we have are the sort of norms that that are sort of there for the society that we're in. So if we want to like challenge them, and it has to be some way of like challenging them from the inside, bringing out their internal contradictions, something like that.
Yeah, and like I think the best way to understand this is through like Hegel's idea of the owl of Minerva. Like the owl of Minerva flies at night, where like what you are doing when you're theorizing usually is a reconstruction of a historical movement of the concepts. And when you start looking at people who think they're not doing that, usually because they're paying attention to problems, like social problems, they are in fact actually doing that. They're just not self-conscious that they're doing that, which is what the tendency toward idealization, that's how that emerges. And so I think the idea is that of the immanently like practical nature of thought, that like thought is a practice in it of itself. And I think it's a question about to what extent, like what makes the idealist and materialist versions of this practice meaningfully different. But I think with what Hegel and Marx do have in common in the sense my old teacher was correct, is that thought is itself practical. So what we are doing is reflecting on social problems, a situation. There's a kind of directionality to the concepts. And so that's why like intellectual history is interesting, because when people intentionally reconstruct it, you can see. So like, good example, I just read a couple months ago, Katrina Forrester's book on Rawls, In the Shadow of Justice. It was kind of the influence of Rawls. She was able to kind of put it into a pretty interesting story about like Rawls reflecting on social problems, and that is how the methodology and the concepts emerged. And then it was the salience of those problems that like made liberal philosophy take the turns it did, because thought is always a practical thing. And like I think that this is why Marx is so like scathing about Proudhon's sort of sense of confidence that he is using Hegelian categories in the right way. Marx is saying, he does all this sardonic making fun of Proudhon for being French and not getting the German way, is because Marx is steeped in the Hegelian stuff, and he's seeing these concepts be used in a way that isn't attendant to the practice of the thought, and he's like, tisk on you, for like being a basic baby. Basically, he's like, you didn't get the project. And Marx has a little arrogant streak to him, and we can all respect that because he's fucking brilliant. So sometimes this goes on, but that is what he's doing, and that's what most of those kinds of polemics are about. Is like, you think you're philosophically sophisticated, but gotcha, I'm the real deal. I think that's most of Marx's moves.
Yeah,
and I'm here for it. Like I love a little. I'm not. We can whether or not one thinks that's a personality flaw is neither here nor there. I think it's hilarious. I think he's often right.
It's not your personality flaw, but it certainly makes me enjoy his writing more.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough. All right, Lillian, this was great. Could keep going for hours, and should do that soon. But where can people find your stuff?
People can find me on Twitter at Class Reductress, and check out my podcast, What's Left of Philosophy. You can follow us at Left of Phil. I write for Jacobin, and then if you're interested in my academic work, I have things on academia.edu, and I will post them on Twitter as they emerge.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Lily. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.